The election of 1912 was very interesting indeed. The Republican Party itself split, leading to the creation of a new independent Bull Moose Party. Never before in U.S. history had an independent party gained so many votes, and never since. But the how and why behind all this needs some explaining. First, let's start with the Electoral College. The Electoral College was established all the way back in the late 1700s. The Founding Fathers established the Electoral College in the Constitution in part as a compromise between the election of the president by vote in Congress and the election of the presidents by popular vote of qualified citizens. What is not mentioned here is the impact of slavery on the development of the Electoral College, with slave states getting more votes despite their qualified voter population being much smaller. But let's not get off track. The main point is that each state gets a certain amount of votes. Instead of these votes being split according to how the people vote, it's an all-or-nothing system. So Missouri, for example, gets 10 votes. If roughly half the population votes one way and the other half the other way, those 10 votes are not split 5 and 5, but rather if, say, the Republicans got 51% of the votes, all of Missouri's 10 votes would go to the Republicans. So why is this important? Well, because of Teddy Roosevelt. If you remember from the last decade, Teddy, despite being qualified to run for president again and all but being guaranteed the nomination, held fast to his promise that he would not run again, suggesting Taft instead. Taft won the election but faced a split party and general political unrest. Progressive Republicans, called insurgents, demanded that the party adopt more progressive policies such as an income tax, tariff reductions, and the direct elections of senators, policies that were supported by a majority of the voting population. Teddy was one such Republican, but the other members of the party refused to budge, and Taft was not the dynamic leader that the party needed in order to keep the rift from happening. In fact, in 1909, when a tariff reform bill was passed that actually increased tariffs instead of lowering them, these insurgents and the general U.S. population were enraged, while Taft called it the best tariff law the Republicans had ever enacted. This, of course, only caused the number of insurgents to grow. Because of the many misunderstandings and conflicts in the Republican Party, this rift grew wider and wider until a boiling point was reached, and Teddy left the Republican Party, fellow insurgents in tow, to form his own Bull Moose Party, which ran for the 1912 election. So instead of having two parties competing, there were three. But, and this is the important part, it was the Republican Party that was split, and the Democratic Party was unaffected. This meant that voters who typically voted Democratic still had the same general politicians to choose from, but those who typically voted Republican had to pick sides. So Taft with the conservative Republicans and Teddy with the progressive Republicans of the Bull Moose Party were essentially at each other's throats, one determined to beat the other to the ground. But what neither of them could do was win the entire sway of their Republican voters or win enough Democratic voters to their side. In fact, all they did was make the swing voters and even some reliable Republicans lose faith in the party and switch Democratic. So all the struggle did nothing but hand the election to the Democrats. So while all that infighting was happening, what was happening on the Democratic side? Well, the Democrats were also paying attention to the demands of the people for a more progressive leader, and they provided with Woodrow Wilson, who, while being a Democrat, was a progressive one. So those Republicans who wanted a progressive leader, but were concerned about the state of their party, could easily switch. Anything that Teddy brought up, Wilson was able to offer a Democratic version. Wilson was even anti-monopoly and promised to break them up, much like Teddy did. So Teddy was unable to sway progressive Democrats away from Wilson. And for any voters who were still not swayed, Wilson's running mate, Thomas Marshall, might have, as Marshall was a Republican. Remember the Electoral College? Here's when it comes in. Voting day. The Republican Party and the Bull Moose Party won 7.6 million votes, 1.3 million more than Wilson. However, these votes were split between two parties, so neither of them won more than Wilson. Additionally, Wilson only had about 42% of the popular vote, but won a staggering 435 electoral votes out of a total of 531. While the Bull Moose Party did gain over 27% of the vote, because of this all-or-nothing system, the Electoral College didn't even award them that, with the party only getting 88 electoral votes. Despite the Bull Moose Party getting less than 1 million more votes than the Republican Party, they got 11 times as much, with the Republican Party winning a measly 8 electoral votes, with only 2 states. Thus, Wilson was handed the presidential election on a silver platter. So who would have I voted for? Well, call me a sucker, but I really like Teddy regardless of if he's a Republican or not. Really, I would have liked anyone who wasn't Taft, and Wilson would have been my second choice, and one that I would have been happy enough with. My fellow Missourians would hold Missouri's place in the Solid South and vote 47% for Wilson, though just over 17% would agree with me that Teddy was the way to go. I wonder if things would have been different if the Republican Party had managed to stay intact. But instead of having Taft as their nominee, they went with Teddy. I think they would have won.